Self-awareness, compassion, especially self-compassion, gratitude, three components that support and sustain a prosperous life. Sound intriguing? Let's take a closer look. This is Prosperity and Something Greater. My guest today is Dan Totaro. Dan's been working as a therapist, consultant, and educator for the last 40 years. He's currently a compassion, fatigue, and resiliency educator and works mostly with professional care providers such as marriage and family therapists, social workers, psychologists, addiction treatment counselors, and medical personnel. I met Dan through his sister, Tina Del Buono, who works as a consultant with me in Top Practices and who I interviewed in season 1. Dan was speaking at the Western Podiatry Conference in Disneyland a few years ago, and I got a chance to hear his perspectives on burnout, compassion, fatigue, and resilience. And I asked him then to join me on a Top Practices call to share his thoughts and his wisdom with my members, and it was extremely well received. You're going to get a chance to hear some of that today. A self-described child of the 60s, Dan is a soft-spoken delight to talk to, especially about our topic of prosperity. You'll enjoy this episode, and you'll just feel better when you complete it, better than you did when you started. Here now, Dan Totaro. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the podcast today. This is Rem Jackson, and with me is Dan Totaro, who I met because he's related to now multiple guests that have been on the podcast. Of course, his sister is Tina Del Buono, who everybody that works with me knows so well, and Dolly Wolverton is his aunt, and so it's getting to be just a little bit of a family affair. But Dan, thanks so much for spending the time with me today.
I appreciate you asking me.
Well, and as I said in our introduction, I wanted to have you on because, you've done such a marvelous job of just giving some perspective to our doctors about the challenges they face, with burnout, which is real, with compassion fatigue, which is real, and it's just been so interesting to hear, your perspective in your work. And I was very intrigued about, how you, who I think deeply about things like this and thinking about your life, how you would look at this interesting concept called prosperity. So let's just go right there and let me ask you, how would you define prosperity for you?
Well, when I was looking around at definitions of prosperity to see if anything fit for me, and the one segment of the definition that spoke to me was enjoying vigorous and healthy growth. Enjoying vigorous and healthy growth. That's the one that spoke to me the most because that's the perspective in which I have looked at things for a long time, Rem, is growth, personal growth. Most for me is the focus. And once I had identified that particular definition, then I looked at what does that mean to me? What components would give me vigorous and healthy growth? And one of these won't surprise you. Maybe none of them will. But my very first one is self-awareness. I feel it's very, very important for each of us, regardless of our definition of prosperity, to foster self-awareness. And I'll talk a little more about what goes into that. The second component, as you said earlier, has become kind of my calling card the last few years, and that is compassion. I feel we need compassion, especially self-compassion. And then the final one is gratitude. I feel that gratitude is a very important component in being able to enjoy vigorous and healthy growth. So those are the three components for me that go into a prosperous life. Obviously, with self-awareness, it's the conscious knowledge of your own character, your own feelings, your own values, your own desires, your own motives, your own behavior, to be aware of those. It may not surprise you, remember that a lot of people go through life without really any conscious awareness of many of those things. Many people, when I was a therapist, I would ask them that question, what are you feeling? Oh, cold, uncomfortable. But for many people, it's hard for them to identify what they're feeling or what their motives for doing something is. And certainly values is many times an area where we don't spend a lot of time thinking about what are really my values? What are those things that I think are most important? And obviously, in regards to prosperity, it's important to know what those are so that you can match that to any endeavor that you engage in. And identifying all of those aspects helps us not only to have joy in our lives, but also to prioritize. What are the most important things to us? Where should I put my energies? A really important component of self-awareness is self-honesty. Being honest about all of those things, about our own character. We can walk around and think, I'm a very nice person and, I like people, but our motives, our values, our feelings, our behavior, most importantly, may not match that. And if we're not aware of what those are, it's really difficult to grow and to evolve as a human being. So self-honesty is really important. And also with compassion, I think one of the most valuable things that we can have as human beings is to contribute to the well-being of others. As you said, my Aunt Dolly was on here and she spoke about service and the importance of service. And to really come from your heart and to really be fulfilled by it, compassion, it has to be focused on the well-being of others. And then self-compassion is to not be overly critical of ourselves, overly blaming of ourselves, to be more understanding, gentle, and honest about who we are and what our feelings are. So those two, self-awareness and self-compassion, are, I think, key components. And then gratitude gets us in touch with, have we been successful in achieving what it is we identify as prosperity? And to be grateful for the opportunity to do that and the things that we achieve. So that's my definition for me for prosperity.
Dan, one of the things I value in speaking with you about topics like this is, what you just shared, because, and how you approach compassion and compassion fatigue and the other, and burnout and the things we've got isn't it true that we human beings spend an awful lot of time seriously overthinking things? Just really overcomplicating and obfuscate and just overthinking things when in fact it can be as graceful and as elegant and as, I'll just try to use this word, very in a profound way, simply as what you just talked about.
Something that I try to live by is that very thing. Life isn't complicated, in my view. We make it complicated.
Yeah, it isn't that hard. But it's a journey to find the simpleness of it. And I think it's even complicated by our devices and the incredible number of communication channels that we're all, unfortunately obsessing over and all the rest of that stuff. It's not easy, but it's simple. I guess that's the point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Well, I love that. I just do. So let's take a step back though. I know you and, I've had some meals with you and enjoyed your company.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had even said this with Dolly, and anytime you're together with your sister, there's good wine involved. That's just the way it rolls. But can you tell us about yourself? What's the defining moment that brought you to your career path, which I think is quite interesting? Chance to learn a little bit about you.
Yeah. Well, also, since, we've spent time together and can see me, that I'm a child of the 60s. I grew up in that period where the focus was less on material and more on contributing. And so when I was deciding to go to college, I decided I wanted to do something that made a difference in the world. And I went about my first 2 years in particular having a smorgasbord of types of classes. Other than the required classes, I took astronomy, anthropology, sociology, philosophy, psychology, all of those kinds of things, and trying to narrow it down. And I narrowed it down for my final 2 years of undergraduate school to psychology and sociology. And so I picked the major of sociology and most of my courses, but I minored in psychology. So all but one of my classes in my last 2 years at undergraduate were in psychology or sociology. And when I got towards the end of my second year, I found sociology fascinating, but I felt that doing research and kind of on the macro level really wasn't what suited me. I would rather make a difference with small groups of people or individuals. I felt I could have more impact there. So I searched around and decided that I would seek a master's degree in marriage and family therapy and did so. And that was making that decision, between sociology and psychology, I think was one of those pivotal points where my life went in a particular direction. And I had a purpose and I had an interest and I had a mission. And so that was the biggest turning point for me. In my career, however, actually it was a book that shaped that career path and that a view of helping others more focused. And that book was, and this is going to sound like a strange title for a book of enlightenment, if you will. It's called, If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him. And I don't know if you're familiar with the book, but Sheldon Kopp. I read that book and I've read it several times. And for those that don't know the book, it's a phrase that Zen Buddhists tell, those who want to become Zen Buddhists, in that the belief that no one can teach you, only you can learn. And Sheldon's comment or way of looking at that is either you're a pilgrim or you're a disciple. And obviously, for him, his definition of a pilgrim was one on a journey of discovery. And a disciple was someone who took someone else's beliefs and factors and spread them to others. And so I decided that as a therapist, I didn't want to have people think the way I do. I wanted to find out for them what would work best for them, what fit in their lives was best. And I was very eclectic as a therapist. I didn't follow Freudian or Jungian or any of those particular ones. I looked at what I thought would be effective and beneficial for whoever I was working with. In fact, I had an experience once. I ran into somebody early on in my career that I had gone to high school with. And they said, well, what are you doing? And I told them, I said, I'm an intern as a therapist. And they said, oh, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that at all. He said, I don't believe that anyone can tell anyone how to live their life. And my response was, neither do I. Neither do I. I have enough to do keeping my own life on track than telling someone else. I don't want that responsibility. So I wanted people to be pilgrims, not disciples. That's the course that I pursued, and a very valuable corner of my belief system came from If You Meet the Buddha.
Wow, that is really great. How did you migrate over to the work specifically with physicians, that I'm familiar with, really the challenges that they face that are pretty steep?
When I was coming to the end of doing clinical work, I wanted to identify something that I could do to give back to those who care for others, whether they be therapists or nurses or doctors or whoever it might be. And so I looked around for something that would fit that. And looking at compassion fatigue and resiliency within caregivers really struck a tone to me. And so that's when I got involved with the Figley Institute. Dr. Figley was one of the early folks to look at compassion fatigue and do research in compassion fatigue, and was certified as a compassion fatigue educator. Because, as you said, these are overwhelming. We lose too many great people. We lose too many great people. I knew a fella that was a physician and a researcher, and this is before I got into this with compassion fatigue, or anybody even talked about compassion fatigue, that got so burned out that he bought a cabin in Wyoming and set the task for himself to hand copy all of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so every day he would get up, eat his breakfast, sit down, and start copying from Encyclopedia Britannica. And that's how broken he was. And that pains me, that people who dedicate their lives to providing care for others, must sacrifice themselves. And I don't think it's necessary.
How long have you been working with caregivers in this regard?
I would say about 8 years.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know you've certainly helped my doctors, and the several times that we've managed to have you share your real thoughts about, resiliency and self-care and how it matters so much. So, just thank you so much for that. So, we all have challenges. We all have obstacles that we face. Can you share what trips you up on your daily journey?
Well, you already touched on it earlier. Overthinking is a part of who I am that I must keep constant vigil in identifying it. Many times I overthink things, make them more complicated rather than keeping it simple. And I continuously remind myself, particularly in higher stress situations, that is the most effective way, is just keep it simple. What is going on? What needs to be done? What do I need to accomplish? What needs to be done? As opposed to, going way outside, out into left field in regards to what the situation is, what I need to do. Oh my God, what if this happens? What if that happens? Those kinds of things. So as you pointed out earlier, like many people, that's a constant visual for me is to not overthink and to keep it simple. And,
it does not come naturally to me.
Mm-hmm.
I am a scenario worker. I'm like, this could happen, that could happen, this could happen, that could happen. And, and one of the things I've learned is there's your body, which, we all can see, but then there's your mind, and your mind's job is to protect you, solve problems, anticipate things, remember stuff that didn't go good before, and go absolutely nutso all the time. And there's the other part of you, which is your spirit I've read some interesting books, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, that talk about it's
Mm-hmm.
the observer, who's paying attention to the mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's the center part. And to try to just take that, I think some people have called it monkey mind. I know you know that phrase, and just calm it down and not let it run the show, but instead let that center really, exert a lot more
Mm-hmm.
influence. It's a much nicer day that way, isn't it?
Much nicer day. Much nicer day.
So, Dan, what would you say is a top strategy that you use to just keep yourself heading in the right direction and not slipping back into those old habits? And, you can share with the rest of us.
Well, as I said a moment ago, really trying to keep it simple, but also, as I mentioned earlier, self-honesty, being honest with myself about, if I'm wanting to accomplish something or grow in a particular way, am I actually doing the work? Am I actually doing the work to do that? And what is my motivation for doing that? And that might sound like, contemplating one's navel or getting too deep into things, but it's really not that involved. Just straightforward, be honest with yourself, say, hey, this is how I handle that, and it's not in line with what I want to do or who I want to be. The other one is being open to change and new information is a strategy that I have, not being someone who says, well, no, especially as you advance in years, it's easy to say, well, I've seen that, I've been there. You're not going to grow if you're not open to change and to new information and new experiences, to continue the pilgrimage, as Sheldon Kopp would say, be open to the pilgrimage. And that's what I try to do, is to move forward, be open to those things that I may not understand, whether it be technology or whether it be advances in other areas, or just experiences or people I haven't run into or situations I haven't faced before. It's easier to try to avoid those things and say, I've not been here. This is uncomfortable. I don't know. It's not my familiar territory. And then the constant visual of not overthinking things, to keep myself in check in that regard.
It's interesting. You said you're a child of the 60s, and I would describe myself as a child of the 70s. And I didn't have older brothers and sisters. I was around, but I was a real little kid. I became much more aware during the 70s. And it's interesting about the idea about being open to learning, because we're living through tumultuous times, and some of that is, surprising to me, obviously, but some of it is it's so good. And I find myself, though, having, grown up and really been formed in a really different time, to be routinely and regularly being open to re-examining things that, I thought I was open about or pretty resolved well, and realizing, no, there's a whole another level of acceptance and understanding that we can all have, and we need to grow. And I'll tell you something, having children is good for you in keeping you.
Oh, yeah.
Honest and growing. Yeah. Cause they force it on you, as a parent, you're like, you can't just say, well, no, cause you don't treat your kids that way. And then you just become a better person. Another side of that is there's so much new music and good stuff that I've picked up for my kids, that I probably would never have even had a chance to listen to by being open.
One of the things of being a child of the 60s, and that informed how I approached doing therapy, is a questioning of authority. Not seeing myself as an authority, as we talked earlier, that I didn't have the answers. Psychotherapy coming out of the Freudian, where all these folks were medical doctors first, and people went to them for the answers. For me, I didn't place myself in that expectation that I had to have the answers and that I was an authority on someone else's life. You can learn a lot from children. You can learn a lot from little kids. When I'm giving my lecture sometime on compassion fatigue and talking about humor, and you may have been there in one of those cases, I talk about spending time with little children, 18-month-old that take joy in a paper cup. They kick a paper cup around, or they put it on the end of their finger, the simple things in life, and the amount of joy that they can get out of that. It's not just teenagers, but you're right, being exposed to that, whether it be children or grandchildren, keeps you on the journey.
It does. Even I have 3 adult daughters, all in their 30s, and it continues, to this very day. And it's a joy and it's a privilege. So, Dan, the people listening to this podcast are interested in really achieving their own version of prosperity beyond what you've already told us, which is quite a bit. Is there any additional advice you might want to just share with everybody?
Well, adding on to what I was saying earlier with the very first question, is to identify what is it you want and what it is you need to get to that point. And does it fit with your values, with your personality, with who you are? I had experience after I started working as a counseling intern. Earlier than that, I had gone to an employment agency, which I'm sure they've died like the dinosaur, but I went to an employment agency to try to find work. And they took my information, and I told them what kind of work I was looking for, as a counselor or working with youth or something of that sort. Well, after I had been working in the clinic for a year or so, I get a call one evening from a person from that agency, and they said, "We have a job we'd like to send you out on." So just out of curiosity, I said, "Oh yeah, what is it?" And they said, "Junior stockbroker." And I said, "No, thank you. I already have a job." And I often think about, if it was only money to get on that path, I might have taken that job. But didn't come anywhere near. Not that there's anything wrong with stockbrokers per se, but it wasn't a fit for me, and at least I thank myself for having enough self-awareness to know that wouldn't have worked. That was not a place for me to go. But also, again, even though, something I'm sure you hear in working with physicians in their practices, Rem, and when you suggest that they try something new, they say, well, I've never done it that way. Tina might work with them in their office process. Well, we never done it that way. To me, that's a statement you don't want to make. If you're looking for some input, if you're looking for growth, to say, I've never done it that way. The old adage, if you do the things the same way, you get the same results. That's what I would suggest to the folks listening, to be open to that and to do the work to get there.
Well, thank you for that. Dan, I got this fun question I ask everybody, and here it is. If you were a toy, what would you be and why?
I would be old-fashioned Legos, because the old-fashioned Legos, unlike the ones nowadays, when my sons were growing up, was just a box of Lego blocks. You didn't put it together and have a car, or you didn't put it together and have, an airplane or whatever, a spaceship. They had a box full of different colored Legos, different sizes, and they could make anything out of it. And that's what I would like to be if I was a toy, because just plain old Legos have so many possibilities. You can do so many things with them.
Yeah, and that's a Pilgrim Lego box, right?
There you go.
Exactly. Yeah, sure. I think that's great. One last question before I let you go. Is there any good book that you could recommend that maybe we could all read?
Yeah, there's a couple. The first one I mentioned earlier, which is If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, Kill Him, by Dr. Sheldon B. Kopp. There's things in there, as you probably know, if you've read it, that are kind of focused towards doing therapy. But overall, I think it asks some very interesting questions and causes you to have to look at what you're doing and how you're doing it. So I would recommend that. But on the other side is a book called Self-Compassion by Dr. Kristen Neff, PhD. She not only talks about what self-compassion is, but she has some exercises in there that you can utilize in looking at how compassionate you are towards yourself. So I think it's a very helpful book.
Well, that sounds great. And I can't thank you enough for spending the time with us. It's been a delight, as I knew it would. As I said to Tina, at some point we'll all get together, and I'm sure I will see you again because it happens from time to time. So Dan, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. Just great.
You're more than welcome, Rem. And again, thank you for including me in this experience.
Okay. All right, everybody. Have a great day. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. No one can teach you. Only you can learn. You're either a pilgrim or a disciple. Are you on your own journey of discovery? Self-awareness, compassion, especially self-compassion, and gratitude. 3 guideposts that support and sustain a prosperous life. I think it's great. Let me know what you think. You can send me an email at rem@toppractices.com. Prosperity is the entire focus of Top Practices, and most doctors are struggling with the business of medicine, and those that aren't truly understand that through association with other successful practitioners, they can take their success to the next level or something greater, like prosperity. Prosperity in business is a function of mindset, marketing, and management. And that is our mission at Top Practices. You can find out more about Top Practices, our marketing and management programs for doctors, our workshops and annual summit at toppractices.com. Until next time, this is Rem Jackson. Smile when you wake up, and then have a really great day. Your best day ever. Nothing is more important.